Sucks. This movie sucks, 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 sucks. Sucks, sucks, sucks. Sucks, sucks, sucks. New movie rant. New movie rant. Hello everyone, my name is GURRDIE the DAEMONOSAUR. This is Devotional Criticism and welcome back to the new movie Rant. And blah blah blah, him sucks. And by that I don't mean him, the Finnish gothic metal band. I want to make that clear, trying to make sure no strays are caught, no shade being thrown to the gothic rock community. Thank all two of you for tuning into this episode. No, the him that sucks this week is definitely him, this early fall season's latest prestige horror release from Universal Pictures and the most recent production of Monkey Paw, the studio founded by genre film maverick and black cinema trend leader Jordan Peele. As with the studio's previous 2021 horror flick, a Nia DaCosta-directed remake of Candyman, as well as more recently, Adama Ebo's debut mockumentary Hunk for Jesus, him sees Peele taking a step back into the producing chair, now shepherding a project culled from the 2022 Hollywood blacklist of very popular but unproduced screenplays, and handing the reins of creative leadership over to a younger journeyman filmmaker, this time one Justin Tipping, who, after some 6 years working primarily as a TV director, finally makes his sophomore feature film, having previously co-written and directed the coming-of-age hood drama Kicks all the way back in 2016. Not like the imprint of Peele's influence is terribly far from this project, mind you, which might be a moot point given how large Peele's shadow looms not only as part of the very visible cohort of American auteurs whose works became veritably synonymous with the so-called elevated horror cycle, but also, of course, as perhaps the most successful and popular of those gurus of a new kind of genre cinema that toes a middle-brow line between cryptic, puzzle-like artistry, taken for granted as being intended for the art house circuit, and excessively dramatized, stylish, high-concept spectacle. Peele's success with Get Out and its follow-up Us after it, more or less on their own, wrote a bunch of checks for what turned out to be a veritable new wave of genre films where not just in front of, but behind the camera, the writers, the directors, the DPs, the composers, the creative faces were almost all people of color, especially otherwise untested black talent, finally making their big breaks in the wake of a path that Peele was practically carving on his own, like Paul Bunyan dragging his axe to make the Grand Canyon. But even to that degree, it has to be said that him is, even as a Monkey Paw production, as a product of Peele's own House of Horrors, this movie is the most Peele-esque experience, right down to the opening scene of him being just such a signature of Peele's first two films. What else but a centered shot of a child sitting transfixed in front of a television. That child in question is Cameron Cade, whose entire family is gathered around the TV for the Super Bowl to uproariously cheer on their banner team, the Saviors, and more especially the team's all-star quarterback Isaiah White, played by Marlon Wayans. Cam's father idolizes White and encourages his son to be just like him, even when White's scoring of the game-winning touchdown comes at the cost of a compound fracture leg injury that threatens to derail White's future playing career. That's the sort of man you need to be, his father emphasizes, the kind who is willing to sacrifice anything for victory. Flash forward to the present day, and Cameron Cade, played by Tyreek Withers, is now a rising star in college football himself, whereas not only was White's career not derailed by his injury, but he in fact went on to lead the Saviors to victory for 7 more Super Bowls, earning him a celebrity status so great that his fans practically worship him like he's the messiah of a cult. And before you get too worried about him being too subtle about this or anything, there is quite literally a scene where Cam is being driven in a shuttle to White's desert mansion, and he's accosted by Saviors fanatics who camp like Burning Man on his property, only for the driver to say, "They're almost like a cult." We'll get into it. His own father having given his life in the Second Gulf War, Cam is determined to fulfill his parents' dreams by getting drafted into the Saviors, with rumors flurrying in the sports world that White is on the verge of retirement, and the deck is practically being cleared for Cam to be his successor. But one night, while practicing by himself at a football field, Cam is attacked by a strange assailant in some kind of Mardi Gras getup or something, and he sustains a severe head injury that ... threatens to torpedo his starting career. Suffering from CTE, and despite the pressure from his agent, played by Tim Heidecker for some reason, Cam is forced to drop from the NFL Combine, only for him to receive a call from his agent alerting him that he is being invited for an extended stay at Isaiah White's own aforementioned desert mansion and personal training compound, so that he can be vetted to join the Saviors as a new second quarterback for White's final season. And then it turns out that Isaiah White, though full of pearls of wisdom about the deep history of institutional racism in football upon first meeting Cam, is kind of bat-crap crazy. Cam is, of course, still suffering from the effects of CTE, which ends up being compounded by the stress of living in isolation as White's honored guest and de facto prisoner. Plagued by strange, surreal visions, subjected to not only White's increasingly violent and psychologically manipulative methods of whipping him into shape, but also the ominous threat of the occult that spreads from the indeed very cult-like wealth and power and immunity White seems to possess. I guess it all comes down to the scene in the trailer. You know, the one where Cam is practicing passing drills, and every time he can't complete a pass, White has one of his minions get beamed right in the f***ing teeth with a football shot out of a throwing machine. Though technically more happens in him, that scene is clearly an important moment in terms of Cam's descent into the true depths of occult madness with White, and it's obvious why it was such a violent centerpiece of the trailer and the publicity for the film. And I remember seeing that scene in the trailer for this movie months ago and being like, wow, that looks so fucking stupid. That looks like the dumbest, most obvious attempt at some kind of edgy, provocative scene that you could think of to be the centerpiece of promoting your football-themed occult horror movie, but which doesn't leave you so much asking thrilling questions about the story of the film, about the setting, of how things get to this point of extremes, and instead has you asking questions more along the lines of, how do they expect anybody to buy into something that absurd, especially if they play it so goddamned over seriously? Well, I'm here with good news, everyone, because for as low-key f***ing stupid as that scene made him look in the trailer, it comes off a million times more shallow and vacant and pointless and stupid in the movie itself. Because despite the time we spend with both of these characters, Cam and White, despite the time we spend going through all of these events, White's victory and injury, Cam's victory and injury, Cam's personal recruitment, Cam witnessing firsthand the isolated, hermetic world in which White forges his prowess and all the dark, supernatural, and unknown that abound in it, none of it contributes to that scene making any more sense in context. The thing you're wondering in that moment is the same as you're wondering through every step that Cam takes the moment that one of White's literal cult followers spits at him as he's driven in the shuttle to the compound. Why doesn't my man, for the lack of a less on-the-nose way of putting it, cut his losses and just get out? Why does this incredibly violent ritual event just feel like just more environmental dressing that is all supposed to be really extreme and up, only to come off as a desperate attempt to shock the audience once you've realized that, at least for the creative minds behind this apparently so popular blacklist screenplay before Tipping and undoubtedly Peele himself went over it for a page one rewrite to work in the latter's own signature for cryptic, pseudo-surrealist storytelling and really obvious socio-political commentary, the realization that, oh, there's really not a lot that you can do with a football-themed occult horror film. It all just adds up to feeling like more forced, superficially shocking, but ultimately quite silly stuff that just bounces off of Wither's leaden performance as the character himself basically proceeds to not evolve, to not grow, to not change in any discernible way, or even to just react or question in any way that raises the stakes of the narrative so that it gradually becomes more than a lot of superficially shocking, but ultimately quite silly, and in the case of Peele's own obvious influence, derivative stuff that happens. There is a rationale for this in the movie itself, or rather, there are several rationales, the first and most prominent of which doesn't seem to do anything but convolute the story. There's Cam's CTE, obviously, as a factor, but him is not a movie that suddenly goes over the deep end once Cam gets knocked in the skull. It's a loud, crazy, ham-fistedly symbolic movie when he's just a child sitting in his living room with his faceless father getting on him about being like their savior, Isaiah White. It's like that when he's just playing college football and getting interviews, and from the moment he does get knocked on the head by, again, some kind of voodoo assassin or whatever, it's obvious that the style through which Peele and Tipping are portraying this narrative is already unmoored from the bounds of what is strictly rational. This is a movie that is already over the top and maximalist in terms of its setting and costume design, its color palette and lighting, its dynamic cinematography and kinetic editing. This is a movie that already begins in a nightmare world in which the actual rules of reality are not so clear, which wouldn't be such a bad thing, except that the implication of any potential psychological dimension to what Cam is going through introduces a question that the film not only can't justify, but never seeks to justify in the first place. Again, it's just more bullshit that happens to Cam, but not something that actually modifies the storytelling or affects him as a character. Knock it into you. Get out of here. Even in nightmarish dream worlds, characters require motivations, and we as an audience can gain a lot in terms of being guided through this shocking world of occult horrors if we get some sense that there is still a defined psyche that is grounding our experience. But then it turns out that, in a twist revealed near the climax, what the real reason is that Cam could never seem to tear himself away from White's influence, or really even seem to start or try at all. So basically, it's like we've been watching a movie with a character whose motivations and decisions that we could never really understand the whole time, and still doesn't make that much sense in the build up to getting to the compound, only for the filmmakers to reveal that they had some secret mechanical reason buried in the fine print of the screenplay for why this character never acts like a character, and instead just like a dumb prop to get from one shallow, surface level, pointless scene of high-concept, eccentric violence to another. It would be easy to say that Him is a movie that can't decide what it wants to be, a fake-out psychological horror or a full-on, fully surrealist art horror in the vein of Lords of Salem, which Tipping and Peele seem to be ripping off Rob Zombie really hardcore with this one. Except even that is obviously giving Peele and Tipping too much credit. They knew exactly what kind of movie they wanted to make, and you know that because while the original title of Skip Bronke and Zach Acker's Blacklist screenplay was GOAT, the acronym for greatest of all time that is far more obvious and prominent in the film than the phrase him, Tipping and Peele got in there and added a bunch of hymns and changed the title so that they could ensure that their film was as obvious in its pretensions as possible. Because a sports-themed horror movie focused on a character who simply wants to be the GOAT at any cost makes some kind of accessible, germane sense. But it doesn't have the pompous, messianic implications of him, and instead making this movie about a completely vacant shell of a young man who gets quasi-scapegoated, I guess, into being a new cult symbol for the dark, satanic, money-making machine that is football, and its extraction from colonized peoples, and its exploitation of their desperation, and its cultivation of toxic masculinity, community, Tipping and Peel have turned him into exactly what they wanted it to be, which is as another of these tiresome video essays that analyze institutional racism through the most obvious and frequently deeply neurotic lenses as possible, masquerading as an actual movie that is about something. And for many people, especially a certain generation of film buffs whose psyches were so molded by Peele and his cohort of elevated horror auteurs, it's very easy for him, at first, to feel like it is a real movie that is going to be about something. Look at how exquisitely stylized every element is, from the costumes to small background details and nuggets of symbolism to the highly saturated colors to the high contrast lighting, emphasizing every grain of surface, every pore and bead of sweat on the face. Look at all this stuff that we use to make sure that every shot of this movie shouts with the intensity of a music video. Well, him is one long music video that doesn't even have the authenticity to feature any music in it. It stinks of the highest pretension that the so-called elevated horror cycle was able to foster for so many hacks who could hide behind the veil of genre cinema to lowball the expectations of their audience. If we just get a bunch of technically minded people who know exactly what they are doing to make this movie look as good as possible, as good as the best Travis Scott music video or Super Bowl Coca-Cola ad at least, we will be able to successfully convince a high enough quotient of our audience that they'll just forget that we spent more time crafting the perfect tea for Marlon Wayans to spill about the secret history of racist appropriation in football than we did to figuring out why, in a scene where our protagonist, a tier 1 athlete in the game of football, would, in one scene taking place in a setting that fully doubles as a football training facility, would see a football rolling down a hallway one night and react like, oh, something really ominous is going on. I'm scared of that football. It's the same naked cynicism that is going to get a lot of otherwise well-meaning people to be like, oh, but Marlon Wayans was so good in this. No! He wasn't! He f***ing sucks in this movie, and it's because he's too excited to realize he's playing a character who isn't even really a character. In a mirror of Wither's dilemma, Wayans is forced to shoulder the role of an antagonist that is all shallow signifiers of eccentricity and craziness, but where he has nowhere to go in terms of really sitting down and crafting this character, of how the world in which he lives has come to make some kind of sense to him, no matter how surreal and nightmarish it is. He's doing the Jared Leto Joker thing through the whole movie, which is just to act crazy, but where there's no variance, there's no diversity, there's no sense that any given situation leads him to respond in different ways besides like a guy who's trying to act crazy all the time just so everybody's too afraid to pop him one. It is the desperate flailing of a man trying to crack the nut of who he is supposed to be as a cipher and vehicle for, again, the most obvious kind of video essay about, geez, have you ever thought about how institutionally racist football is and how, like, it seems like so many people's lives are in the hands of a bunch of greedy white men? And you know what? Yes! I have! And you know what? Even as far as cinematic video essays go, I don't think it can be stressed enough how Tipping and Peel took this thing in the laziest direction possible. I'm sorry that this channel keeps beating the drum of this so often, but Night Swim is a movie about a swimming pool that eats people. And it's one of the best horror movies of the 21st century. It's way better than Get Out, in my opinion. And Get Out is already really good, but the reason Night Swim is a great litmus test for virtually any kind of horror film, whether the straight mainstream stuff or the more cerebral artsy kind, it is a movie that you can measure all hackery and pretension against because there is no goddamn reason that a movie about a pool that eats people should be so well written, should be so well acted, should be so well shot. And the thing is that once you've gotten through this really good movie about a pool that eats people, you realize that without having to show off or spill any tea at all, The people who made Night Swim also made a really good horror movie that is itself about long legacies of colonial violence and environmental devastation bubbling to the surface. It's not just a movie about a pool that eats people. Him, on the other hand, is the sort of post-Get Out production that, with the direct cosign of the guy who made Get Out, can only be a shallow, poor man's excuse for Get Out, but with football instead of snow bunnies. Except that even there they had to be derivative because we also have Julia Fox as Isaiah White's white she-devil wife. So good to know that the people who made this are absolutely 100% really concerned about the racist legacy of football and are not just neurotic, college-educated, middle-class nerds working through their psychosexual anxieties and their jealousy of more physically talented people and pandering to the most obvious and reactionary of racial phobias in order to grind their axe. Night Swim is a great movie because it's a movie about a pool that eats people that makes you think the people who made it really cared that you really cared about this story about a pool that eats people. After sitting through what felt like 3 hours of him, I'm not even sure I can tell you that Peele and Tipping even give a shit about football. Like, how are you going to make a football-themed horror movie? How are you going to make, spoiler alert, society with football? This movie doesn't have an original bone in its body. How are you going to make that movie about a guy who is forged in the crucible of football all the time and make it come off like even your protagonist doesn't really give a shit about football, isn't even remotely motivated by a passion for sports? Because isn't that the whole thing? Call me crazy or blinkered by my own implicit biases if you want, but it does occur to me that probably the reason it's so easy for these cabals of rich white men to take advantage of so many underprivileged youths, especially men of color, especially brown and black-skinned men, is because people who get into professional sports really are passionate about professional sports, and especially at the tier 1 level that Cam is, they're going to be the sort of people who are not just blind followers. They're going to be incredibly disciplined. They're going to be the sort of people who walk into a training facility and it doesn't matter who the all-star football player is who's coaching them. They're going to see a guy get socked in the teeth with a football over and over and over again and say, no, this is bullshit. You guys are out of your mind. I'm out of here. Peele and Tipping can only boil down football to what they, as pussy nerds, perceive as the essential, passionate drive of football, which is violence and victory. Except even in one of Isaiah White's early tea-spilling conversations with Cam, he basically unintentionally admits that, yeah, football used to be a way more incredibly violent sport, but the influences of people of color actually made it a more strategic, safer sport. Like, who is a football fan who is going to watch this movie and is going to buy this idea of this all-star, 8-time Super Bowl winning God among men who is like, the whole point of this is violence, to be as brutal as possible, be willing to sacrifice anything for victory? I have a hard time believing that anybody who really loves football is going to see that and not think, oh, a nerdy pussy who doesn't like sports at all wrote this. Because no, that's not what it takes to win at football. There's actually a lot of discipline and thought. You know, there's a lot of strategy that goes into it. How could the people who made this movie make it so bad? I'll tell you how. It's because they are so far up their own asses as filmmakers that they think the power of football is negligible as an emotional force in their own story and is secondary to their own anodyne, neurotic commentary on how, just like basically every other American institution, there's a lot of endemic racism to professional football. It's hilarious because this movie could not have been released at
a worse time, given that the biggest stories in football right now have nothing to do with the violence. They have to do with, like, this whole deal of the Players Association basically being deeply incestuous with the managers and the team owners when they're supposed to have an oppositional relationship with it. There's a lot of fucked up, even borderline occult, Kabbalistic things that go on in football, but just the fact that these guys crash into each other as a part of their sport, that's like the least corrupt or interesting thing about it. And even him's own shallow, anodyne social commentary would be fine if it weren't for the fact that these same pretentious nerds who made this movie don't have anywhere to take their own story because they don't have a story. They just have the most obvious and shallow point that, just like Isaiah White talking about the history of football's appropriation from indigenous people and exploitation of people of color in general, upon which they can just lump a bunch of convoluted stuff that never clarifies the emotional narrative of the film and just leads to the filmmakers showing their own asses about their own alienated, neurotic obsessions with the sport as representing something that they're clearly just going back to high school and to college and thinking about those jocks that they were convinced were just a bunch of dumb guys who just lifted weights and crashed into each other. No, I'm sorry to have to break the news to everyone. A lot of those jocks were really smart, really disciplined people with a unique set of skills that was not just their brute strength or how fast they were. It was the fact that they were uniquely talented in thinking on their feet and working together as a team and actually, in fact, not deciding that anything is worthy of destruction in favor of victory. I have a small sneaking suspicion that the nerdy kids in high school, the egotistical artistes and creators who are projecting a lot more of that attitude, that victory and dominance and ownership and idolatry at all costs, way more than these football players. All Peel and Tipping can do is just lump a bunch of shit in. Here you get the nod to CTE. Here, for the millionth time, you get a stereotypical and downright socially inaccurate portrayal of the rich, successful black man who has to have a white wife, even though I'd be pretty damn sure without taking a look right now that most black football players, even at the elite tier, are either presently married to and or exclusively have dated black women. Just a shot off the port bow. Have no idea if it's accurate. I'm pretty sure it is, though, because I've watched a lot of FD Signifier videos. He made a great video essay on the inaccurate portrayal of interracial relationships in media, and especially about how it's reactionary and pejorative in its portrayal of black men, and how it's contiguous with this complete myth of black men just lusting after white women. It's really neurotic. It's really problematic. It is not a good look for Peel and Tipping. And overall, you just get the most obvious pantomime story about the great man who sells his soul to become great. I don't know, dog. Do you think there's a more horrifying story to tell from all those dudes who had field goal dreams but just washed out? Did nobody see Hoop Dreams? That's a way more horrifying and captivating film than anything Peel and Tipping could cook up while just, I don't know, smoking weed and laying on a couch while... Why do I give a shit about this dumb black hole of a man who walks into the modern day equivalent of Boris Karloff's mansion in The Black Cat, who only ever gets taken advantage of in the most obvious and clandestine of ways possible, as opposed to, say, a dude who is good, but just not good enough? The most patronizing this movie gets is when they have to, again, ride on the long fading success of Get Out to have Cam say at least twice that the sort of occult circles that Isaiah is running in are doing white people shit. Now, I don't really have a dog in this race. I'm just a 237 million year old dinosaur mutant demon thing. But knowing a thing or two myself about the dark arts, this is where I get to weigh in and say that Peel needs to lay off his own farts. My dude, white people didn't invent paganism. They invented accusing people they didn't like, blaming their problems on some nefarious occult forces, on some shadowy cabal, any vision that Peele himself has presented in Get Out, or that Tipping now rips off with him with full approval. This satanic psychosexual white people shit is just downstream of conspiracy theories and witch panics and anti-Semitic phobias that white people have imposed on their colonial subjects. It is the perfect simulation of a hidden agenda, a nefarious evil that can then be used to distract the oppressed from what is occurring right in front of their eyes and addressing it in material terms. You can smell a mile away that Peele and Tipping probably think that Marlon Wayans' character is a real genius move. Like, wow, a strong, famous black man who says all the correct shit about institutional racism himself, but it's all just a glib costume that he wears to gatekeep his own position and participate in that evil institution. It's like, motherfuckers, that's you! You're the ones who are so proud of yourself to kick the straight dope to a mass audience even though you have nothing to say because you don't actually care. It's not just that you made a football-themed horror movie where it doesn't seem like you actually give a shit about football. It's that you made a football-themed horror movie and it's not even clear that anybody working on this even wants to make horror movies anymore or cares about them, really. It's all just a convenient foil for showboating, and the results are a turgid embarrassment. Peele practically dousing his own short-lived legacy in gasoline and striking a match to it with the biggest, loudest, most shallow ripoff of one of his own goddamn movies, taking every single last most annoying trait of his own works and expunging anything that seemed to root them in a sense of common humanity or a desire to have your vision resonate emotionally and not just be explained point blank to us as we first keep getting distracted wondering, why the f doesn't this dude just get out? Only to gradually adjust to the new distraction of the question, did the guys who make this really think that this was some real shit they were talking? Because this is just a dumb movie about a dumb guy who a bunch of dumb shit happens to him and he never flinches. I'm giving him a charitable 1.5 out of 5, a truly awful movie, one of the worst of the year. And with that, I'm tapping out of here. Thank you all so much for sticking through this whole video. F the comments unless they're about how much you love me. Otherwise, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is GURRDIE the DAEMONOSAUR. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the new Movie Rant. I'm gonna catch you guys next time.